A giant Apache was forced to marry an obese widow, but what she did next left him in tears. The church bell tolls. Dust swirls on the main street as the townsfolk whisper. A towering warrior stands stiff at the altar, chained by duty, and beside him, a woman mocked for her size, clutching her shawl with trembling hands. They never asked for this marriage. They never wanted it. Yet when the door to her lonely ranch creaks open, something unexpected begins kindness where he expected. Ridicule and courage where she was told she had none. But just as hope flickers, the railroad arrives with papers to steal her land and the only water for miles. The sheriff's keys rattle. The giant is thrown behind bars. The widow, humiliated, clutches a secret locked away in her late husband's Bible, a truth powerful enough to save them both or destroy everything. What happens when a woman scorned by the world dares to fight back? And can a broken warrior's tears become the beginning of love? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The church bell's harsh clang echoed through San Miguel's dusty streets, drawing townsfolk like moths to flame. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across weathered wooden sidewalks as people hurried toward the white-clapboard church, their boots stirring up clouds of Colorado dirt. Inside the church, Margaret Ann Calloway stood alone at the altar, her late husband's black dress hanging loose on her stout frame. Her calloused fingers twisted the worn fabric as whispers slithered through the pews behind her. The dress had been her only choice. She hadn't been able to afford a proper wedding dress, and truthfully, this wasn't a proper wedding at all. Look at her, someone whispered too loudly. Finally caught herself a man, even if he ain't exactly willing. Maggie's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the rough-hewn cross mounted on the wall. The late summer heat pressed down through the church's tin roof, making sweat trickle down her neck. She could hear the shuffle of feet outside, the murmur of voices growing louder. The door creaked open, and a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Heavy footsteps echoed on wooden floorboards. First the measured stride of army boots, then another. Set, slower, and more deliberate. Maggie forced herself not to turn around, but she could feel the presence filling the church behind her. When Dakota finally stepped into view, her breath caught. The Apache warrior stood head and shoulders above everyone else, his broad shoulders rigid beneath a clean but threadbare shirt. Dark eyes set in a weathered face stared straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The scars on his wrists from the army post shackles were still visible, a stark reminder of his recent captivity. Preacher Josiah Whitcomb cleared his throat, his tall frame drawing up even straighter as he opened his Bible. His booming voice filled the small church. "We are gathered here today," Maggie barely heard the words. She sneaked glances at the man beside her, her soon-to-be husband, noting how he stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. Only the slight flare of his nostrils with each breath showed he was flesh and blood. The army agent, a thin man with a waxed mustache, stepped forward with a marriage license. "This union is a condition of release," he announced crisply. "The Department of Indian Affairs has determined that supervised integration through marriage is the most suitable arrangement for." Yes. Preacher Whitcomb cut him off, clearly annoyed at having his ceremony interrupted. "Do you, Margaret Ann Calloway, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Maggie's throat was dry as dust. "I do," she managed to whisper. "And do you?" The preacher paused, consulting a paper. "Dakota, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" For a long moment, silence filled the church. Maggie could feel curious eyes boring into her back, could practically taste the anticipation in the air. Finally, Dakota gave a single, sharp nod. "He needs to speak the words," the army agent insisted. Dakota's jaw clenched. "I do." His voice was deep and quiet, with just a hint of an accent. "Then by the power vested in me," Preacher Whitcomb continued, rushing through the rest of the ceremony as if eager to be done with it, "I now pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss, no congratulations, just the scraping of pews as people stood, already starting to gossip among themselves. Maggie caught fragments of their words as she and Dakota walked down the aisle. "Better than she deserves. Savage for a husband. Match made in hell, if you ask me." The afternoon sun hit them like a physical blow as they stepped outside. Maggie squinted, trying to ignore the crowd that had gathered to gawk. Her small wagon waited at the hitching post, the ancient mare dozing between the traces. They walked in silence through the town, past the general store where the owner stood in the doorway shaking his head, past the saloon where men paused in there, drinking to stare. Maggie held her head high, though her hands trembled. Dakota moved like a shadow beside her, his steps silent despite his size. The road to her ranch wound through scrubby hills dotted with pine trees. The wagon creaked and swayed, but neither of them spoke during the hour-long journey. As the sun began to set, they crested the final rise, and Maggie's small ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A modest house with weather-beaten siding, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a chicken coop, and a small corral. A few cattle grazed in the distance, and somewhere a rooster crowed its evening song. Maggie climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the ride. She fumbled with the key, aware of Dakota waiting patiently behind her. The lock finally turned with a rusty click. The door swung open to reveal her simple home, a main room with mismatched chairs arranged around a scarred table, a cast-iron stove in one corner, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom. She lit the oil lamp with shaking hands, and warm light spilled across the worn floorboards. "It ain't much," she said softly, the first words she'd spoken since their vows. "But it's home." Dakota stepped inside, ducking his head to clear the doorframe. His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. The lamplight cast flickering shadows across his face, making his expression even harder to read. Maggie stood awkwardly by the stove, suddenly uncertain what to do next. This man was her husband now, forced upon her just as she had been forced upon him. The thought made her stomach twist with a mixture of shame and something else she couldn't name. The lamp sputtered, sending shadows dancing across the mismatched furniture. Her father's old rocking chair, the straight-back chairs her late husband had traded for, the rough-hewn table she'd helped build herself. These pieces of her life, now shared with a stranger who stood in her home like a mountain cast in shadow, waiting for what would come next. Maggie moved around her small kitchen with practiced steps, though her hands shook as she ladled the thick beef stew into two worn ceramic bowls. The spicy aroma of pepper and sage filled the cramped space, mixing with wood smoke from the cooking fire. Outside, the last rays of sunset painted the Colorado sky in shades of purple and gold. She set the bowls on the scarred table, along with a loaf of yesterday's bread and a crock of butter. Dakota sat rigid in one of the mismatched chairs, which creaked beneath his weight. The flickering lamplight cast strange shadows across his face, making his expression even more unreadable. "Would you like coffee?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When he gave a slight nod, she poured 2 cups from the battered tin pot, the dark liquid steaming in the evening air. The silence pressed down like a heavy blanket as they began to eat. Maggie couldn't help noticing how Dakota held his spoon, carefully, deliberately, as if he hadn't used one in a long time. His eyes remained fixed on his bowl, shoulders tense as though expecting a blow. The quiet grew until Maggie thought she might suffocate from it. A floorboard groaned beneath her feet, and she jumped slightly, nearly spilling her coffee. The absurdity of the situation, sitting across from this giant of a man who was now, by law if nothing else, her husband, suddenly struck her. "Well," she said, surprising herself with a small chuckle, "I reckon you can tell why folks call me the best cook in San Miguel. Ain't nobody else brave enough to serve up something this tough." She poked at a particularly stubborn piece of beef with her spoon. "Though I suppose that's what comes of learning to cook from my pa. Man could burn water if you gave him half a chance." She risked a glance at Dakota and found him watching her, something shifting in his dark eyes. The corner of his mouth twitched, just slightly, and some of the rigidity seemed to ease from his shoulders. "Truth is," Maggie continued, warming to her subject, "between my cooking and my size, I'm surprised the army didn't warn you what you were getting into. Probably figured you'd faced worse during your captivity." She patted her ample middle with a self-deprecating smile, "Though I doubt it." Dakota set his spoon down carefully. "The stew is good," he said, his deep voice soft but clear. "Better than army food." Maggie blinked in surprise, both at the words themselves and the hint of dry humor in his tone. "Well, that ain't saying much," she replied. "Even my pa's cooking would be better than army food." Something that might have been a smile ghosted across Dakota's face before disappearing. He returned to his meal, but the tension in the room had eased somewhat. They finished eating in a silence that, while not comfortable, was at least less strained out. As Maggie cleared the bowls, the lamp began to sputter, its oil running low. The familiar evening sounds of the ranch drifted through the walls. Chickens settling in their coop, cattle lowing softly in the distance, the wind sighing through pine needles. She knelt by her rocking chair, folding her hands as she did every evening. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly to Dakota, who had moved to stand by the window. "I always say my prayers before bed." He made no response, but she hadn't really expected one. Closing her eyes, Maggie began to pray, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Lord, I thank you for this day, for the food on our table, and for the roof over our heads. I thank you for bringing Dakota safe through his captivity, and I ask that you heal whatever wounds he carries, seen and unseen." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "Give us both strength for whatever path you set before us, and help us find your purpose in all this. And Lord, help us learn to trust, even when trust seems impossible. Amen." When she opened her eyes, she caught a glimpse of Dakota's face in the dying lamplight. Something glistened on his cheek before he turned sharply away, moving into the shadows by the hearth. Maggie pretended not to notice as she busied herself banking the fire for the night. "The bedroom's down the hall," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But I reckon you'd prefer to sleep out here, at least for now. I've got some blankets you can use." She fetched the bedding from the chest by the wall, thick wool blankets she'd traded for last winter. Dakota took them with a slight nod, already unrolling them near the hearth. The floorboards creaked as he settled his large frame on the makeshift bed. "Well then," Maggie said awkwardly, "good night." She retreated to her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her in her narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about her home. Maggie stared into the darkness. A coyote called somewhere in the hills, its lonely cry echoed by others in the distance. She wondered what God's plan could be, joining two such different lives together. In this strange way, in the main room, Dakota lay awake on his blankets, watching moonlight creep across the floorboards. The woman's prayer echoed in his mind, stirring emotions he'd thought long buried. Another coyote's call pierced the night, and he found himself wondering the same thing. What purpose the Creator could have in bringing him here, to this place, to this woman with her strange mixture of humor and kindness. The night wrapped around the small ranch house like a thick quilt, while inside, two people lay awake in separate rooms, each contemplating the mysteries of divine purpose and the unexpected paths that had led them to this moment. Dawn broke over the Colorado plains in streaks of pink and gold. Maggie rose early, as she always did, but this morning felt different. The sound of movement in her main room reminded her she was no longer alone. Through the thin walls she heard Dakota already awake, his footsteps careful on the creaking floorboards. She dressed quickly in her work clothes, a faded calico dress and sturdy boots, and stepped into the kitchen. Dakota stood by the window, alert as a hawk, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains. He acknowledged her presence with a slight nod. "Reckon we should see to the chores," Maggie said, pulling her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "Got plenty that needs doing around here." They started with the barn, where Maggie showed him the daily routine. The familiar smells of hay and horse filled the air as she demonstrated how to measure feed for the two workhorses and handful of cattle. "These old girls need extra attention," she explained, patting a brown Mare's flank. "Especially Penny here, she's particular about her oats." Dakota moved with quiet efficiency, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the animals. He seemed most at ease here, away from the confines of the house. When a skittish calf shied away from him, he waited patiently, speaking soft words in Apache until the animal settled. "You've got away with them," Maggie observed, impressed. He glanced at her, then back to the calf. "Animals know truth. They see past," he gestured to himself, to his prison-issued clothes, "past what others see." The morning progressed as Maggie led him around the property. She pointed out the broken fence sections that needed mending, showed him where tools were stored in the lean-to shed, and demonstrated the trick to working the temperamental well pump. "Water's the lifeblood out here," she explained, working the pump handle until clear water gushed forth. This well's never run dry, even in the worst drought. Most reliable source for miles around. They fell into an unexpected rhythm as the morning wore on. Dakota's strength made quick work of the heavy tasks that had long challenged Maggie. She found herself relaxing slightly as they worked, the awkwardness of their situation easing somewhat in the familiar routine of ranch life. Just before noon, as they were replacing rotted fence posts along the eastern boundary, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A well-dressed man on a gleaming bay horse rode up, his suit marking him as a town man rather than a rancher. "Mrs. Calloway," he called out, not bothering to hide his sneer as his gaze moved between her and Dakota. "I'm Morton Phillips, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He pulled a thick envelope from his saddlebag. "Got some papers here you'll want to see." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward, conscious of Dakota's solid presence behind her. "What sort of papers?" Phillips dismounted, his polished boots raising dust. "Seems your property holds particular interest for the railroad. More specifically, that well of yours." He thrust the envelope toward her. "Only reliable water source for 20 miles, essential for a planned route through the territory." Maggie's fingers trembled slightly as she took the envelope. She pulled out several official-looking documents covered in dense legal writing that made her head swim. Her cheeks burned as she pretended to study them, the words blurring before her eyes. "Your marriage yesterday was quite the talk of the town," Phillips continued, his tone dripping with contempt. "Though I doubt even such an unusual arrangement will help you keep this land for long." He smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "Best start thinking about where you'll go when you lose it all." Maggie's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "This is my home, Mr. Phillips. My husband's blood and sweat is in this soil." "Your dead husband's, you mean?" Phillips glanced meaningfully at Dakota. "This new situation won't change the facts. You've got 1 month to respond to our offer." He swung back into his saddle. "Though I'd suggest accepting sooner rather than later. Things tend to get difficult for folks who stand in the railroad's way." They watched him ride off, dust settling in his wake. Maggie's hand shook as she tucked the papers into her apron pocket. The weight of them felt like lead. "I can't read them," she admitted quietly, staring at the ground. "Not really. Tom, my first husband, he handled all the papers and such. I never learned proper, beyond basic words." Her voice caught. "Been managing by memory and guesswork since he passed." Dakota was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his deep voice firm with conviction. "The railroad men, they are like coyotes. They circle, looking for weakness." He turned to face her fully. "But this is your land. We will defend it." Maggie looked up at him, surprised by the strength of his words and even more by his use of we. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, they walked the fence line together. Their boots crunched on dry grass, and a cool evening breeze carried the scent of sage. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the awkward quiet of strangers forced together, but the shared contemplation of two people facing a common threat. They paused at the western corner of the property, where the land sloped down toward the creek bed. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the kind of sunset that reminded Maggie why she loved this harsh, beautiful country so much. "My people know about fighting for land," Dakota said quietly, looking out over the darkening plains. "About those who would take what is not theirs to take." Maggie nodded, her hand unconsciously touching the papers in her pocket. "I reckon we both know something about that now." They stood there until the light began to fade, two unlikely allies watching darkness creep across the land they both now had reason to defend. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had found common ground in their determination to protect the small piece of earth they called home. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in soft rose and amber. Maggie stepped out onto her weathered porch, pulling her shawl tight against the morning chill. Dakota was already up, standing near the barn with the stillness of a man used to watching the sun rise. "Thought I might show you around proper," Maggie called out, her breath visible in the cool air. "There's tools and such need knowing about." Dakota nodded, falling into step beside her as she led the way to a small, leaning structure behind the main barn. The tool shed door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing walls lined with implements, shovels, picks, hammers, and coils of rope hanging from wooden pegs. Tom, my late husband, he kept everything organized just so, Maggie explained, running her hand along a worn workbench. Been trying to keep it the same. She gestured to the half-finished barn visible through the doorway. That was his last project. Meant to be storage for winter hay, but her voice trailed off. Dakota studied the abandoned construction, his eyes taking in the solid foundation and partially raised walls. Good bones, he said simply. Strong beginning. They spent the next hour going through the tools, Maggie explaining which were used for what tasks. Dakota listened carefully, his large hands testing the balance of each implement. When they reached the broken fence section they'd spotted yesterday, he selected a hammer and several rails without hesitation. I'll see to my bread making, Maggie said, watching him begin work with quiet efficiency. Been too long since I had fresh loaves in the house. Back in her kitchen, Maggie lost herself in the familiar rhythm of bread making. Her hands worked the dough with practiced movements, kneading and folding as morning light streamed through her window. Every so often, she glanced out to where Dakota worked, his powerful frame moving with purpose as he repaired the fence. Sun climbed higher and sweat beaded on Maggie's forehead as she shaped her loaves. She set them aside to rise and wiped her hands on her apron. Reckon I ought to help with that fencing, she muttered to herself. Can't let him do all the heavy work. Outside, the heat had grown fierce. Maggie approached the fence line where Dakota was securing a new rail. Without a word, she grabbed the other end of a heavy post he was positioning. The weight of it shocked her, and she struggled to lift it properly. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she tried to maintain her grip. Suddenly, the world tilted. Her legs wobbled, and the post slipped from her grasp. Before she could fall, strong hands steadied her, guiding her to sit on a nearby stump. I'm sorry, she gasped, shame burning hotter than the sun on her face. I ain't much use with the heavy work. Never have been, truth be told. Dakota said nothing for a moment, just waited until her breathing steadied. Then he picked up a long piece of split rail and laid it across a rock. Watch, he said quietly. He positioned himself at one end of the rail and placed a smaller stone under it. With minimal effort, he used the rock as a fulcrum, easily lifting the heavy wood. The earth gives us strength, if we know how to use it. My mother taught this. Wisdom over force. Maggie watched, fascinated, as he demonstrated the technique again. Your mother taught you about leverage? A ghost of a smile touched Dakota's lips. She taught many things. How to read the sky for rain. How to find food in empty places. How to lift more than your arms can carry. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. She said even the smallest bird can move a branch if it knows where to push. Together, they worked through the afternoon. Dakota showing Maggie how to use simple mechanics to accomplish tasks she'd always thought beyond her strength. As the sun began to set, they returned to the house where the smell of fresh-baked bread filled the air. Over supper, Maggie served thick slices of warm bread with beans and coffee. The silence between them was different now, comfortable rather than strained. Dakota ate slowly, seeming to savor each bite. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Maggie said finally, pouring more coffee into their cups. Must have been hard, being taken from her. Dakota's hands tightened briefly around his cup. She taught me to find wisdom in hard things, to see beyond what is taken to what remains. He met Maggie's eyes. Like you with this land. You lost much, but you remain strong. Maggie blinked, surprised by both his words and the gentleness in his voice. Don't feel very strong most days, she admitted. Mostly feel like I'm barely holding on. Strength is not always in holding on, Dakota said softly. Sometimes it is in knowing how to bend without breaking. After the dishes were done, they sat by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Maggie cradled her coffee cup, feeling more at ease than she had in longer than she could remember. Dakota's presence, which had seemed so threatening just days ago, now felt like a shield against the loneliness that had plagued her since Tom's death. Later, as Dakota spread his blanket by the hearth, Maggie paused in her bedroom doorway. She watched him settle into his makeshift bed, his massive frame somehow making the space feel safer rather than more confined. For the first time in years, the night ahead didn't seem quite so long and empty. They were still strangers in many ways, but something had shifted between them. A fragile trust born of shared work and quiet understanding. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over the Colorado plains. Maggie stood before her small mirror, pinning her best bonnet with trembling fingers. The black fabric of her church dress pulled tight across her broad frame, making her wince at her reflection. "We ought to go," she called out to Dakota, who stood silent in the doorway. "Show folks we mean to honor our vows, even if they was forced upon us." Dakota's face remained impassive, but his eyes held a wariness that made Maggie's heart ache. He wore the clean shirt and trousers she'd found in Tom's old chest, though they strained across his massive shoulders. Outside, Maggie's wagon waited, hitched to her steady bay mare. The wooden seat creaked as they settled side by side, Dakota taking the reins with practiced hands. The morning air carried the scent of sage and prairie grass as they rolled toward town. Wagon wheels raising dust in their wake. San Miguel's clapboard church sat proud on its small rise. White paint gleaming in the morning sun, the bell tolled, calling the faithful to worship. Maggie's stomach knotted as Dakota helped her down from the wagon, his touch careful but distant. Boots and Sunday shoes scuffed on wooden steps as townsfolk filed into the church. The whispers started as soon as Maggie and Dakota appeared in the doorway. "Look who's come to service," a woman's voice carried clearly. The fat widow and her savage husband. Maggie's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin and walked forward. Dakota moved beside her like a shadow, his face carved from stone. They found a pew near the back, the wood groaning under their combined weight. The whispers continued, cutting through the morning hymns like thorns. "Ain't right, them being here. She always was desperate for a man. More beast than man, if you ask me." Dakota's hands clenched at the last comment, which came from Deacon Morris, a thin-faced man with hard eyes. Maggie felt Dakota's muscles tense, saw the dangerous fire kindling in his dark gaze. Before he could rise, she gripped his hand tight. "Please," she whispered, her fingers trembling against his. "The Lord sees true, even when men don't." Something flickered in Dakota's expression, surprise perhaps at her touch or her words. Slowly, the tension eased from his frame, though his eyes remained fixed ahead. Preacher Whitcomb took his place at the pulpit, his voice booming through the small church. "Let us pray," he intoned, and the congregation knelt. Maggie and Dakota moved to do the same, but the preacher's eyes swept past them as if they were invisible. His prayer rang out, speaking of righteousness and judgment, while they remained caught between standing and kneeling, trapped in a moment of cruel exclusion. The service dragged on, each minute an eternity of sideways glances and poorly hidden sneers. When the final hymn faded, Maggie and Dakota were the first to leave, walking straight back through the gauntlet of stairs. They had nearly reached their wagon when a soft voice called out, "Mrs. Calloway?" Maggie turned to find Mrs. Whitcomb, the preacher's elderly wife, hurrying toward them. Her wrinkled face held none of her husband's hardness as she pressed a folded piece of paper into Maggie's hand. "For both of you," the old woman whispered, her pale eyes kind. Before anyone could notice, she shuffled away, leaving Maggie clutching the scrap of paper. In the wagon, headed home, Maggie carefully unfolded the note. Written in shaky script was a single line of scripture, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." Tears pricked at her eyes as she smoothed the paper with her thumb. Beside her, Dakota drove in silence, but something had shifted between them. They were no longer just two people forced together. They were allies against a world that wished them shame. The wagon rolled on through the morning heat, carrying them away from the town's judgment and back to the sanctuary of Maggie's small ranch. Neither spoke, but the silence felt full of understanding, a shared endurance of scorn. A quiet determination to stand together. As they passed through her gate, Maggie tucked the precious scrap of scripture into her dress pocket, close to her heart. The words felt like a shield against the morning's cruelty, a reminder that strength could bloom in unexpected places even in the strange. Bond forming between a lonely widow and a warrior far from home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maggie's ranch as she and Dakota returned from church. Their shared experience of scorn had forged something new between them, not quite trust, but a determination to prove their worth. Maggie tied her apron with purpose, surveying her kitchen. "Them cowhands from the Peterson spread always pass by here Mondays," she said, more to herself than Dakota. Reckon I might fix up something special like. Through the evening, she worked steadily, kneading dough for fresh bread and stirring a pot of hearty beef stew. The kitchen filled with warmth and savory smells. Dakota watched from his place by the hearth, his dark eyes following her movements as she added wild onions and herbs to the bubbling pot. Come morning, the sound of horses and tired voices drifted through the homestead. 4 dusty cowhands reigned up outside, their usual route taking them past Maggie's ranch. The scent of fresh bread and stew drew them like moths to flame. Ma'am, the oldest hand touched his hat brim. Something sure smells mighty fine. Maggie's cheeks flushed pink. Got plenty to share, if you've a mind to rest your horses a spell. The men exchanged glances, then dismounted. Dakota stood silent in the doorway, his presence making them hesitate until Maggie gestured them to the rough wooden table. Steam rose from the bowl she set before them. The men dug in, wariness giving way to surprise as they tasted her cooking. Miss Maggie, one said between mouthfuls, this here's the finest stew I've had since leaving home. The bread, too, another added, reaching for a second thick slice. Soft as clouds and sweet as summer. Their praise brought a glow to Maggie's face. After the men rode on, spreading word of her cooking, more riders began stopping by. Each day brought new faces, drawn by tales of Maggie's hospitality. As the week progressed, Dakota began teaching Maggie his own skills. One crisp morning, he led her to the edge of their property where tall grass swayed in the breeze. With patient gestures, he showed her how to set wire snares for rabbits. Watch, he said softly, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he demonstrated the proper knots. The rabbit follows its path. The snare waits. Maggie's fingers fumbled with the wire, but Dakota never showed impatience. By midday, they had caught 2 plump rabbits. Dakota then guided her through the meadow, pointing out edible plants, tender wild greens, mushrooms and herbs that could flavor their meals or soothe ailments. My mother taught me these things, he said, his voice holding a rare warmth as he handed her a sprig of wild mint. The land provides, if we know where to look. Later that afternoon, Maggie stood by the cow pen, hands on her hips as she watched. Dakota approached their ornery milk cow, Bessie. The cow had given Maggie fits that morning, refusing to let down her milk. She just needs a gentle hand, Maggie called out, trying not to smile as Dakota positioned himself beside the cow with his bucket. Bessie had other ideas. As soon as Dakota's fingers touched her udder, she shifted sideways, nearly knocking him over. He steadied himself, muttering something in Apache that made Maggie raise her eyebrows. 3 more times Dakota tried, and 3 more times Bessie danced away. Finally, the cow kicked out, sending the bucket flying and spraying milk across Dakota's shirt. The sight of the mighty warrior, dripping with milk and wearing an expression of absolute indignation, broke something loose in Maggie. A giggle escaped her lips, then another, until she was laughing outright, deep, genuine laughter that shook her whole body. Dakota stared at her for a moment, then his stern face cracked. A smile tugged at his lips, growing into a low chuckle that joined with Maggie's laughter. The sound of their shared mirth echoed across the ranch yard, startling the chickens and making Bessie swish her tail in confusion. That evening, after supper was cleared away, Maggie gathered her courage and brought out Tom's old Bible. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, its pages marked with her late husband's notes. I ain't much good at reading, she admitted, her voice quiet in the lamplight. Tom, he tried to teach me some, but she trailed off, shame coloring her cheeks. Dakota moved his chair closer to hers, his presence steady and unhurried. Show me, he said simply. Maggie opened the Bible to a familiar page where Tom had marked Psalms with the pressed flower. Her finger traced beneath the words as she struggled to sound them out. The Lord is my shepherd, she began haltingly. I shall not want. When she stumbled, Dakota waited patiently. No judgment showed in his face, only quiet attention as she worked through each word. The lamplight cast a warm glow over them both as they bent over the book together. As the evening deepened, Maggie's confidence grew. She read slowly but with increasing sureness, taking comfort in the familiar rhythms of the verses. Dakota listened intently, occasionally nodding as if the words held meaning for him too. Finally, Maggie closed the Bible, her hands lingering on its worn cover. The room felt different somehow, warmer, safer. She looked up to find Dakota watching her with gentle eyes, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the life either of them had chosen, but sitting there in the quiet evening, surrounded by the fruits of their day's labor, fresh bread cooling on the rack, herbs drying from the rafters, the lingering scent of rabbit stew, they had found something unexpected. A home, slowly transforming from a place of forced coexistence into one of shared purpose and growing affection. Maggie returned Dakota's smile, feeling the tight knot of loneliness in her chest loosen just a little. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this moment, they had won a small victory over the darkness that had brought them together. Late summer painted the Colorado countryside in rich golds and ambers. The corn stood tall in Maggie's fields, its tassels swaying in the warm breeze. She stood on her porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron as she watched Dakota stack the last of the dried corn against the barn wall. "Looks like we might get more folks than expected," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. Several wagons had already sent word they'd be coming to the barn-raising supper, though others had declined with thinly veiled excuses. Dakota nodded, his movements steady and sure as he arranged the corn stalks. The past weeks had softened his wariness, though caution still lived in his eyes. He'd spent days preparing for this gathering, mending chairs and tables, ensuring the barnyard was spotless. Inside the kitchen, Maggie had outdone herself. 3 plump chickens roasted in the cook stove, their skin turning golden brown. Fresh bread cooled on every available surface, and 2 apple pies sat ready near the window. The smell of cinnamon and sage filled the air. "Lord, let them come with open hearts," she whispered, checking the corn pudding one last time. As the sun began its slow descent, the first wagon arrived. The Peterson family climbed down, their 3 children already eyeing the dessert table Maggie had set up in the yard. Behind them came the widow Jenkins and her grown son, then the Morgans from the next valley over. "Welcome, welcome," Maggie called out, her face flushed with pleasure and nervous energy. "Please, help yourselves to some cider." Some cider. Dakota stood quietly by the barn, nodding respectfully to each arrival. Some of the men returned his greeting, while others looked away. But the children, they watched him with undisguised curiosity. Little Sarah Peterson, no more than 6 years old, tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, he's tall as a tree," she whispered, loud enough for all to hear. A ripple of awkward laughter broke the tension. More wagons arrived until nearly 20 people filled the yard. Some faces Maggie recognized from church, others were neighbors she'd only seen in passing. They gathered around the long table she'd set up, drawn by the abundant food and the promise of community. Maggie's heart swelled as she watched them fill their plates. Her cooking had always been her pride, and tonight it seemed to work magic. Between bites of chicken and fresh bread, conversation began to flow. Stories of harvests past and weather predictions mixed with compliments about her corn pudding. "This beats any meal I've had at the hotel in town," declared old Mr. Morgan, helping himself to seconds. "Maggie, you've got a gift." As the evening deepened, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Children chased fireflies at the edge of the light, their laughter carrying across the yard. Dakota had kept his distance, but Maggie noticed him slip away to his workbench and return with something in his hands. It was a wooden flute, carefully carved with patterns that caught the lamplight. He sat on a stump near the barn and began to play. The sound was unlike anything the settlers had heard before, sweet and clear as a mountain stream, with a hint of wildness that spoke of open skies and ancient hills. The children stopped there, games drawn to the music. One by one, they crept closer, until they formed a half-circle around Dakota. Their parents watched, uncertain at first, but the peaceful scene before them was hard to resist. Sarah Peterson was the boldest. She reached out to touch the flute when Dakota paused between songs. "Did you make it?" she asked. Dakota nodded, his usual stoic expression softening. "From River Cane," he said quietly. "Would you like to see how it works?" Soon he had a cluster of children around him, showing them how to hold their fingers to make different notes. Their attempts produced more squeaks than music, but their giggles filled the air. Parents who had kept their distance found themselves drawing closer, Caught up in their children's joy, Maggie watched from the food table, her heart so full it ached. This was what she'd prayed for, not just tolerance, but genuine connection. For one precious evening, the barriers of prejudice seemed to thin like morning mist in sunlight. As the moon rose higher, families began to gather their belongings. Mothers collected sleepy children, fathers shook hands and discussed the weather. Several made a point of thanking both Maggie and Dakota before they left. "You'll have to share your bread recipe, Maggie," Mrs. Morgan said warmly. "And thank your husband for entertaining the little ones. I haven't seen Tommy sit still that long since he was born." Maggie blushed at the word husband, but Dakota, standing nearby, didn't correct the assumption. He simply inclined his head in acknowledgement. As the last wagon disappeared down the dusty road, Maggie stood in her yard, wiping her brow with her apron. The tables were cleared, the dishes washed, and a peaceful quiet had settled over the ranch. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for this evening." Dakota moved beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. He gazed at the horizon where the last wagon had vanished, his expression thoughtful. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, and in the distance, clouds were gathering over the mountains. Morning sunlight streamed through Maggie's kitchen window, casting warm squares of light across the wooden table where she and Dakota sat sharing breakfast. The peaceful scene seemed to echo yesterday's successful gathering. Fresh biscuits steamed on their plates, and coffee filled the room with its rich aroma. Maggie watched Dakota butter a biscuit, marveling at how his huge hands could be so gentle. The morning was quiet except for the clink of forks and the distant lowing of cattle. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form the words, heavy pounding rattled the front door. "Open up, sheriff's business." The voice was gruff, authoritative. Dakota's shoulders tensed. He rose slowly, placing himself between Maggie and the door. She touched his arm briefly before moving to answer it herself, smoothing her apron with trembling hands. Sheriff Bledsoe stood on her porch, flanked by 2 deputies. Behind them, the railroad agent from before smiled coldly, a roll of papers clutched in his manicured hands. The morning sun glinted off the sheriff's badge as he adjusted his hat. "Mrs. Calloway," the sheriff said, not quite meeting her eyes. "We've got some business to attend to." The railroad agent stepped forward, unrolling the papers with a flourish. "This is a warrant, madam. Your deed has been found invalid, improperly filed after your husband's death. This property reverts to railroad custody." Maggie's face drained of color. "That's not possible. My Henry bought this land fair and square." "The law's the law, Sheriff," Bledsoe said flatly. His gaze shifted to Dakota, who stood silent and watchful in the doorway. "Your husband is now trespassing on railroad property." Dakota's fists clenched at his sides. One of the deputies reached for his gun. "Now see here," Maggie started, her voice rising. "We've done nothing wrong." The scene exploded into chaos. The deputies lunged forward as Dakota moved to protect Maggie. A fist caught him across the jaw, another in his ribs. Though he could have fought back, his strength was evident in his massive frame. Dakota held himself in check, knowing violence would only make things worse. "Stop it," Maggie screamed as they wrestled Dakota to the ground. "Please, you're hurting him." The railroad agent stepped carefully around the struggle, keeping his polished boots away from the dust. "Resistance will only make things worse, Mrs. Calloway. Your illegal tenant is under arrest." Sheriff Bledsoe produced iron handcuffs. They looked absurdly small against Dakota's wrists, but the deputies forced them closed while keeping him pinned. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye where he'd been struck. "Maggie." Dakota's voice was steady despite his position. "Be strong." One of the deputies shoved Maggie aside as she tried to reach him. She stumbled against the kitchen table, sending breakfast dishes crashing to the floor. Coffee splashed across her clean floorboards, biscuits scattered like stones. They dragged Dakota out through her front door, his boots leaving deep furrows in her yard. Maggie followed as far as the porch, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. Despite the warm morning, the sheriff's wagon waited, its wooden sides reinforced with iron bars. "You can't do this," she called out, her voice breaking. "This is our home." But they were already loading Dakota into the wagon. The railroad agent tipped his hat mockingly as he mounted his horse. "Good day, Mrs. Calloway. I suggest you begin packing." Maggie watched through tears as they drove away, dust rising behind the wheels. When they disappeared around the bend, she forced herself back inside. Her kitchen was a mess. Overturned chairs, broken dishes, spilled food. The peaceful breakfast scene destroyed. She sank to her knees among the wreckage, clutching her shawl tighter. "Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "give me strength. Show me the way." For a long moment, she stayed there, letting tears fall. Then, slowly, she pushed herself to her feet. They'd taken Dakota, but they hadn't taken her spirit. Not yet. Moving with purpose now, Maggie straightened her apron and pinned her hair back up. She would not let them see her broken. Outside, she hitched her old mare to the wagon, checking the straps twice as Dakota had taught her. The familiar work helped steady her hands. The road into town stretched before her like a challenge. Maggie clucked to the horse and took up the reins, her jaw set with determination. The morning sun beat down as she drove, but she barely noticed the heat. Her mind was focused on the jailhouse and the man who'd become more than just a forced husband. San Miguel's buildings rose ahead, the church steeple pointing accusingly at the sky. Maggie guided her wagon down the main street, ignoring the stares and whispers of townspeople. The jailhouse squatted at the far end, its windows barred and uninviting. She pulled the wagon to a stop, gripping the reins until her knuckles whitened. Through the iron bars of the jail windows, she caught a glimpse of movement. Dakota's broad shoulder, perhaps, or just a shadow. The sight of those bars made her heart clench, but she wasn't done fighting. Not while she had breath in her body and faith in her heart. Maggie straightened her back, lifted her chin, and prepared to face whatever came next. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as Maggie's wagon rattled into San Miguel's dusty main street. Her hands gripped the reins tightly, knuckles white against the worn leather. The usual bustle of the town seemed to pause as she passed, like ripples spreading across still water. Mrs. Henderson, the mercantile owner's wife, stood on her porch with two other women. Their fans fluttered like nervous birds as they whispered behind gloved hands. Maggie caught fragments of their words, sharp as thrown stones. Size of a barn door. Shame about her property. Serves her right, taking up with a savage. Maggie's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes forward, focused on the jailhouse at the end of the street. A group of ranch hands lounged outside the saloon, passing a bottle between them. One nudged another as she passed. "Hey, widow woman," a voice called out. "Your wild Indian cooling his heels behind bars where he belongs?" Laughter erupted, cruel and cutting. Maggie's hands trembled on the reins, but she refused to acknowledge them. The old mare plodded steadily onward, each hoofbeat bringing her closer to her goal. Outside the dry goods store, little Tommy Jenkins pointed at her wagon. "Mama, look. It's the Indian's fat wife." "Hush now," his mother scolded, but her eyes held the same mockery as she hurried her son inside. The jailhouse loomed ahead, its weathered boards and barred windows a stark reminder of why she'd braved this gauntlet of scorn. Maggie pulled the wagon to a stop, gathering her courage before climbing down. Her boots raised small puffs of dust as she crossed to the entrance. Sheriff's deputy looked up from his desk, his expression a mixture of boredom and disdain. "Come to see the prisoner, I reckon?" "My husband," Maggie corrected firmly, though her voice quavered. "I have the right to visit him." The deputy shrugged, lifting a ring of keys from his belt. 5 minutes, no more. He led her down a short hallway to the cells. The air grew cooler and damper, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and old straw. In the last cell, Dakota sat straight backed on a narrow cot, his dignity intact despite his surroundings. "Maggie." His voice was soft but strong, carrying across the space between them. She rushed to the bars, reaching through to grasp his outstretched hand. His skin felt warm against hers, calloused palm pressing reassurance into her flesh. "Are you hurt?" she asked, noting the dried blood above his eye where they'd struck him. "This body has known worse," he said simply. "But my spirit," his dark eyes met hers. "My spirit grows stronger, seeing your courage." Tears welled in Maggie's eyes. "I don't feel courageous. The whole town mocks us. They think we're nothing but a joke, a fat widow and her savage husband. They see only the surface," Dakota said, his thumb stroking her hand. "My mother taught me. The Creator sees the heart, and your heart, Maggie Calloway, is strong as summer oak." A sob caught in her throat. "I don't know how to fight this. The railroad has money, lawyers, the sheriff in their pocket. What chance do we have?" "We have truth," Dakota said. "We have right, and we have each other." His grip tightened on her hand. "My people have faced worse odds. We survive because we do not surrender what is ours." The deputy's boots scraped the floor behind them. "Time's up." "I'll find a way," Maggie promised, reluctant to release Dakota's hand. "I won't give up our home. I swear it. I know." His eyes held hers until the last possible moment. "Remember my mother's words. The Creator sees." The walk back through town seemed longer, heavier. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the street. The same people still lingered, their mockery following her like persistent flies. "Best start packing, Mrs. Calloway. Reckon you're redskin. Won't be joining you for supper." Ain't natural, a marriage like that. Each word stung, but Maggie kept her head high. She thought of Dakota's quiet strength behind those bars, of his mother's wisdom passed down through generations. The Creator sees the heart. Her own heart might be breaking, but it wasn't beaten. Tears tracked silently down her cheeks as she drove home. But they were different now. Not tears of shame or despair, but of determination. The setting sun painted the sky in fierce oranges and purples. Like a battle flag raised against the coming night. Her little ranch waited ahead, the house still showing signs of the morning's violence. Overturned chairs visible through the window, dark coffee stains on the porch boards. But it was home. Their home. And she would fight for it with everything she had. Maggie climbed down from the wagon, her movements heavy with exhaustion but purposeful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. But tonight, she carried Dakota's strength with her, wrapped around her heart like a shield against the world's cruelty. She paused on the porch, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the horizon. Her tears had dried, leaving tracks in the dust on her cheeks. But her resolve had crystallized into something hard and bright as a diamond. The house felt empty without Dakota's presence, but she could still feel the echo of his words, his faith in her. The Creator sees the heart. And her heart, though wounded, was ready for the fight ahead. The empty house creaked in the fading light as Maggie lit the oil lamp with trembling fingers. The flame cast dancing shadows across the disarray left by the morning's violence. Chairs still overturned, dishes scattered. Coffee grounds ground into the floorboards. But she had no time for tidying now. Her heart pounding, she hurried to the bedroom, where an old cedar chest sat at the foot of her narrow bed. The brass key hung on a ribbon around her neck, warm against her skin where she'd kept it since Thomas died. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. Inside, familiar scents rose up, lavender sachets, wool blankets, and the musty smell of old papers. Maggie's hand shook as she lifted out stacks of documents, spreading them across the quilt. Bills of sale for cattle. Letters from Thomas's family back east. Railway schedules yellow with age. "Please, Lord," she whispered, sorting through the papers. "Help me find something, anything." But the documents blurred. Before her eyes, the careful handwriting swimming into meaningless patterns. Her cheeks burned with familiar shame as she confronted her secret, the one she'd hidden even from Thomas in their early marriage. She could manage simple words, but legal papers might as well have been written in Greek. Moving to the parlor, she pulled open drawers and cabinets, searching for anything that might help. Old receipts fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves. Her fingers brushed leather, Thomas's ledger books, filled with neat columns of numbers she couldn't decipher. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. "I should have learned," she muttered, wiping her cheeks with her apron. "Should have swallowed my pride and asked for help when Thomas was alive." The mantel clock ticked steadily, marking time she couldn't afford to waste. Dakota was counting on her. Their home was at stake. She couldn't let her shame stop her now. Her gaze fell on Thomas's Bible, sitting in its place of honor beside his chair. The leather was worn smooth from daily handling, the pages dog-eared and marked. She lifted it carefully, remembering how Thomas would read aloud each evening, his finger moving beneath the words as she secretly tried to follow along. As she opened the cover, something slipped from between the pages. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she turned it over, seeing Thomas's careful handwriting across the front, Water rights deed, keep safe. Maggie sank to her knees beside the chair, the Bible cradled in her lap. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered. "You knew, didn't you? Knew how important this would be someday." The seal cracked as she opened it, revealing official-looking papers with an affidavit with an affidavit Vincent. Embossed stamp in one corner. Though she couldn't read the legal language, she recognized signatures at the bottom, Thomas's name, and others she knew were important men in the territory. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by a wave of guilt. How long had this deed been here, waiting to be found? How many times had she dusted this Bible, never knowing it held the very thing that could save their ranch? "Lord," she said aloud, her voice stronger now, "I've been such a fool. Hiding my shame instead of facing it. Letting fear rule me instead of faith." She clutched the deed to her chest. "I promise you now, no more hiding, no more letting fear win." Rising from her knees, Maggie moved to Thomas's desk. She lit a second lamp, pushing aside the clutter to make space. Her hand shook as she dipped the pen in ink, but her determination was firm. "Dear Judge Carter," she began, forming each letter with painstaking care. The words came slowly, each one a battle against years of self-doubt. But she pressed on, explaining about the deed, requesting a hearing. She had to stop several times to wipe tears from her cheeks before they could spot the paper. The paper. When she finished, she sat back, studying her uneven handwriting. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest, like her marriage to Dakota, unexpected, but true. The lamp had burned low, and her back ached from hunching over the desk, but a sense of peace had settled over her. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, carefully folding the letter, "for showing me that sometimes our greatest blessings are hidden, in plain sight, like this deed in Thomas's Bible, like the strength you've given me through Dakota." She sealed the envelope and addressed it to Judge Carter, her letters wobbly, but readable. Tomorrow she would ride into town again, facing the mockery with her head held high. She had something worth fighting for now, not just the ranch, but the chance to stand tall beside the man who had shown her what real dignity looked like. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Hope had taken up residence, filling the corners where fear used to lurk. Maggie placed the deed carefully back in its envelope, tucking it into her apron pocket where she could feel its presence, solid and reassuring against her hip. Later, as she straightened the kitchen and swept up the coffee grounds, she found herself humming the hymn from last Sunday's service. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The words held new meaning now. She had been lost in her own fears for so long, but at last she was found. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold as Maggie's wagon rolled towards San Miguel. The morning air held an autumn chill that made her pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Thomas's Bible lay wrapped in a clean cloth on the seat beside her, the precious deed nestled safely between its pages. The streets were already stirring as she guided her horse past the general store. Women sweeping their porches paused to stare. A group of men outside the barbershop nudged each other, whispering behind their hands. Maggie kept her eyes fixed ahead, though her cheeks burned at their scrutiny. The courthouse stood at the end of Main Street, its white-painted boards gleaming in the early light. Maggie's hands trembled as she tied her horse to the hitching post. The worn leather of the Bible felt reassuring against her palm as she lifted it from the wagon seat. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, smoothing her best dress, the black one she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, let out twice since then. She'd pinned her hair carefully this morning, trying to look respectable, though she knew many would only see her size. The courthouse steps creaked under her weight. Inside, the vestibule was already crowded with townspeople. Conversations hushed as she entered, replaced by meaningful looks and poorly hidden smirks. Maggie clutched the Bible closer, feeling the deed's outline through its pages. Through the double doors, the courtroom stretched long and imposing. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes and golden beams. Judge Carter sat behind his raised desk, shuffling papers with stern attention. The railroad agent, Mr. Harrison, stood at the front table in a fine suit, arranging documents with precise movements. Maggie made her way to the empty table on the left, each step echoing in the sudden quiet. The wooden chair creaked as she settled her weight, the Bible centered carefully before her. More townspeople filed in. Behind her, filling the benches with rustling skirts and murmured commentary, Judge Carter's gavel cracked against wood. This hearing will come to order. His voice carried authority earned from years on the bench. We're here to settle the matter of water rights and land claims regarding the Callaway Ranch property. Mr. Harrison rose smoothly, adjusted his silk tie. Your Honor, I represent the Western Pacific Railroad in this matter. He lifted a leather portfolio. I have here properly filed documents showing the railroad's prior claim to water rights in the disputed territory. The judge nodded. Proceed, Mr. Harrison. The agent began presenting his case, each word polished and precise. He spread maps across the judge's desk, pointing out survey markers and property lines. His voice dripped with quiet confidence as he detailed the railroad's plans for development. Furthermore, Harrison continued, casting a dismissive glance toward Maggie, the current occupant has shown no legitimate proof of ownership. The widow Callaway is, he paused delicately, perhaps too limited in understanding to properly manage such valuable resources. Titters rose from the gallery. Maggie's face burned, but she kept her spine straight, remembering Takota's quiet dignity in the face of scorn. I have documented evidence, Harrison went on, that no valid deed exists for her supposed claim. He smiled thinly. The poor woman is simply his eyes swept over her figure, too overwhelmed by basic matters to comprehend the situation. More laughter rippled through the courtroom. Judge Carter frowned but didn't silence it. Your Honor, Harrison concluded, I move that the property be immediately transferred to railroad ownership with fair compensation to Mrs. Callaway for any improvements made. The judge turned his stern gaze to Maggie. Mrs. Callaway, do you have any response to these claims? Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood, her fingers white-knuckled around the Bible. The courtroom seemed to swim before her eyes, faces blurred into a sea of judgment and mockery. She could hear whispers behind her. Look at her, she can barely stand. Married that savage. What did you expect? Probably can't even read the documents. The last whisper cut deepest because it held truth. Shame threatened to overwhelm her. But she thought of Takota in his jail cell, believing in her. She thought of Thomas, leaving the deed where she would find it when the time was right. Your Honor, she began, her voice quavering but growing stronger, I do have proof of our claim to the water rights. Her fingers trembled as she set the Bible on the judge's desk. Harrison laughed openly. A family Bible? Really, Mrs. Callaway? This is a court of law, not a prayer meeting. Judge Carter leaned forward, skepticism clear in his expression. Mrs. Callaway, do you have actual documentation to present? Maggie stood as tall as she could, feeling the weight of every stare. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Her hand shook as she reached for the Bible's worn cover. The courtroom held its breath as she opened it, countless eyes fixed on her trembling fingers. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, heavy with possibility and dread. Maggie could feel destiny balanced on a knife's edge as she prepared to reveal what lay hidden in those sacred pages. Maggie's fingers trembled as she opened the Bible's weathered leather cover. The sealed envelope lay exactly where she had found it, tucked between the pages of Psalms. The courthouse felt so quiet she could hear the ticking of the wall clock and the distant whistle of a passing train. With careful movements, she lifted out the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but Thomas's neat handwriting remained clear across the front. Water rights deed, Callaway Ranch. She held it toward Judge Carter with both hands. Your Honor, Maggie said, her voice stronger than she expected. Before you open this, I need to tell the truth about something. She swallowed hard, aware of every eye upon her. I can't read more than a few words. Never could. That's why I didn't know about this deed until now. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Judge Carter's eyebrows rose slightly as he accepted the envelope. When my Thomas died, Maggie continued, her chin lifting, I was too ashamed to tell anyone I couldn't read the papers he left. I just kept everything exactly as it was, hoping to figure it out somehow. She brushed a tear from her cheek. But now I know that hiding the truth only made things worse. God's law says we must walk in the light. The judge carefully broke the seal and unfolded the document. Harrison shifted impatiently, his polished boots squeaking on the wooden floor. This appears to be a properly executed deed, Judge Carter said slowly, studying the paper. Dated 1873, witnessed by. His eyes widened slightly. My predecessor, Judge Morrison himself. Harrison surged forward. Impossible. Let me see that. Step back, Mr. Harrison, Judge Carter commanded sharply. He continued examining the document, comparing it to other papers on his desk. The silence. Stretched taut as a fiddle string, the courtroom doors swung open. Heads turned as heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor. 2 deputies led Dakota inside, still in shackles. Despite his chains, he walked with quiet dignity, his dark eyes finding Maggie's across the room. She straightened her spine, drawing. Strength from his presence. This deed, Judge Carter announced, predates the railroad's claim by 3 years. It specifically grants water rights from the creek through the Callaway property. He looked up, his expression stern. The signature and seal are genuine. The witnesses are reputable. Harrison's face flushed red. But, Your Honor, surely you can't. Furthermore, the judge continued, this document was properly recorded with the territory. The fact that Mrs. Callaway was unaware of its existence does not invalidate her legal claim. He turned to the deputies. Remove those shackles from Mr. Dakota. He and his wife have every right to defend their property. Property. The sound of chains falling echoed through the stunned silence. Dakota rubbed his wrists, then moved to stand beside Maggie. His presence felt like a mountain at her shoulder, solid and protecting. Harrison slammed his portfolio shut. This is outrageous. That woman is nothing but an illiterate fool who— Silence! Judge Carter's gavel cracked like thunder. Mr. Harrison, you will show respect in this court. The law is clear. The Callaway deed takes precedence. Maggie's hands shook as relief flooded through her. She felt Dakota's fingers brush her arm, steadying her. Mrs. Callaway, the judge continued more gently. Your honesty about your reading difficulties speaks well of your character. The law cares about truth, not education. This land and its water rights remain legally yours. Tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks. She fumbled with her handkerchief. Overcome by the moment, to her surprise, Dakota stepped forward. His deep voice carried clearly through the courtroom. Among my people, he said, we have a name for those who show great courage, who stand tall despite fear. He turned to face Maggie, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes. Nagokea, woman of strength. The tenderness in his voice made her breath catch. His tears fell freely now as he spoke again in Apache, soft words she couldn't understand but felt in her heart. Judge Carter's gavel fell one final time. This hearing is concluded. The Callaway claim stands. Harrison stormed from the courtroom, muttering threats about appeals, but Maggie barely noticed. She stood in the circle of Dakota's strength, her Bible clutched to her chest, knowing that truth and law had prevailed. The morning sun streamed through the windows, touching everything with gold, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly at peace. The courthouse doors creaked open into the bright afternoon sun. Maggie blinked, momentarily dazzled by the light streaming down on the wooden steps. Her heart still raced from their victory, the judge's words echoing in her mind. Beside her, Dakota stood tall and dignified, finally free of chains. For a moment, neither moved. The street before them was lined with townsfolk who had spilled out of the courthouse. Their faces showed a mix of shock, shame, and something new, respect. The usual sneers and whispers were absent, replaced by an expectant hush. Maggie felt a gentle touch on her hand. She looked down to see Dakota's strong fingers intertwining with hers. The gesture was deliberate, done in full view of everyone. Her cheeks warmed, but she gripped his hand firmly in return. Together they descended the courthouse steps. Their boots made hollow sounds on the worn wood. Each step felt like a declaration of truth, of dignity, of unity. The crowd parted before them like water around stones in a stream. Mrs. Peterson, who had often whispered cruel jokes about Maggie's size, now studied the dusty toes of her boots. Beside her, the general store owner removed his hat, offering a slight nod as they passed. Even young Tommy Jenkins, who had once thrown rocks at Dakota, hung back against his mother's skirts, eyes wide with something like awe. Sheriff Mills stood near his office, arms crossed. His deputy nervously fingered his gun belt, but the sheriff raised a hand in clear warning. No one would interfere with them today. The law had spoken. They walked the length of Main Street, past the mercantile where Maggie had endured countless sidelong glances, past the church where they had weathered scorn just days before. The afternoon sun cast their joined shadows long. Across the dusty street, a tall, straight figure and a shorter, sturdy one, moving in perfect step dotted the jail, they paused. Dakota released Maggie's hand with gentle reluctance. "I must collect my things," he said softly. She nodded, waiting outside while he disappeared into the dim interior. Through the barred window, she heard the jailer's keys jingling, drawers opening and closing. Her fingers worried the edge of her shawl, remembering how it had felt to see him behind those bars. When Dakota emerged, he carried a small bundle wrapped in deerskin, all his worldly possessions. His mother's beaded medicine pouch hung once, more around his neck, and his father's knife rode at his hip. But it was the hand-carved flute, tucked carefully in his belt, that made Maggie smile. She remembered the children gathered around him at the barn raising, enchanted by its sweet notes. They stood facing each other in the late afternoon light. The street had emptied now, leaving them in a pocket of privacy. Maggie's hands twisted. In her apron, as emotions she had held back in the courthouse finally surfaced. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her voice catching. Not just of losing the ranch, but of being alone again. Of never being, she swallowed hard, of never being worthy of love. Dakota's dark eyes softened as he gazed at her. One hand rose to touch her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Among my people," he said, his deep voice gentle, "we believe the Creator places souls together for a purpose." His thumb brushed her skin. "You are my heart, Margaret Ann Calloway. Your strength, your kindness, your courage, these make you worthy of all love." Fresh tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks, but these were healing tears, washing away years of doubt and shame. Dakota drew her close, and she pressed her face against his buckskin shirt, breathing in the scent of sage and leather that had become so dear to her. When they finally parted, both had damp eyes and full hearts. Without words, they walked to where their wagon waited, tied in front of the livery stable. The old bay horse nickered a greeting, stamping one hoof impatiently. Dakota helped Maggie up onto the wooden seat, his strong hand steady at her waist. She settled her skirts as he swung up beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. The leather creaked as he gathered them, preparing to guide them home. The sun hung low on the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Drove slowly down the rutted street, past the last buildings of town. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was rich with understanding. Each bump and sway of the wagon brought them closer to their ranch, their home. The vast Colorado sky spread above them like a blessing, streaked with sunset colors. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Maggie breathed deeply, feeling truly free for the first time in years. Beside her, Dakota sat straight and proud, no longer a captive but a man claiming his place in the world. As the wagon rolled on toward home, Maggie's hand found his again. Their fingers wove together, strong and sure, like the threads of a blanket, creating something new and beautiful from separate strands. They were no longer two people forced together by circumstance, but two hearts chosen by love, driving into their future beneath the wide and welcoming sky. Twilight settled over the ranch like a soft blanket, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and blue. Inside the snug kitchen, the iron stove radiated warmth as Maggie stirred a pot of fragrant stew. Steam rose in lazy spirals, carrying the rich aroma of beef, carrots, and sage throughout the room. The familiar scrape of wood against wood drew her attention to the window, where Dakota worked steadily to repair a loose shutter. His strong hands moved with purpose, testing the hinges and adjusting the fit until it hung true. The last rays of sunlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, making them gleam like starlight. "Almost finished," he called softly through the open window. "This one won't rattle in the next storm." Maggie smiled, remembering how that same shutter had kept her awake on lonely nights before Dakota came. Now its repair was just one more way he helped make their house into a true home. As dusk deepened, Dakota came inside, brushing wood shavings from his shirt. The lamp on the table cast a golden glow across the room, warming the simple furnishings. The sturdy chairs, the worn Bible on its shelf, the copper pot hanging by the stove. These familiar things seemed transformed in the gentle light, made precious by the love that now filled their home. Without words, they knelt together on the plank floor. Maggie's cotton skirts rustled as she folded her hands, and Dakota's quiet breathing matched her own. Side by side, they bowed their heads in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for your mercy and strength, for justice done, and for bringing us together in your perfect time." Dakota's deep voice joined hers. "Creator of all things, we give thanks for this home, this land, and the water that brings life." Through the open door came the steady sound of water flowing in the troughs, a promise of prosperity secured not just for them, but for generations to come. The thought brought unexpected laughter bubbling up from Maggie's heart, light, joyful sounds that spoke of freedom and peace. Dakota's own rich chuckle joined hers as they rose from prayer. Their eyes met across the table, hands reaching naturally to clasp together. His calloused fingers wrapped protectively around her shorter ones, strong and gentle all at once. In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild songs floating across the darkening prairie. But inside, all was peace and warmth. The lamp's glow touched everything with gold. Maggie's soft curves, Dakota's proud profile, the steam rising from their shared supper. They moved together to stand in the doorway, Dakota's arms settling comfortably around Maggie's shoulders. Above them, the first stars winked into view, bright points of light in the vast Colorado sky. The ranch spread out before them, the solid barn, the straight fence lines, the glimmer of water in the troughs, all of it now truly theirs, claimed not by force or law alone, but by faith and freely chosen love. Maggie leaned into Dakota's embrace, feeling his heart beat steady and true against her cheek. Together they watched night settle over their home. Two hearts made one under the rising stars. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while, subscribe, and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.